To think about meditation, especially as it relates to this conversation that we've been having here. The way it occurs to me these days is like meditation is shifting into a pure state of being. In the ordinary course of events, as you're moving through your life, we talk about how to manage the thought process and how to manage living your life as a person, the psychological life as a person, the functional life as a person. And so in that process, whether you're actually doing things that require what we call the working mind, or whether you're going through life and there is an awareness of the thinking mind such that the thinking mind is no longer in the forefront, sucking up all of your attention and energy. And this happens when you have started to exist in a state of being in which there's clarity about the idea that you're not a doer. And that there's clarity about the idea of determination. When you're actually living in that experience, although the mind continues to run, the person mind continues to run, the effect of it and the way you're related to it is completely different. So you're not being that, and you're not seeing everything from there. You're being awareness. And the idea of being awareness means that you're connected to the source. And the idea of being connected to the source means that you are thoroughly convinced that you are not a doer, and your experience is that of not being a doer. And because of that, you are not cut off from the source. So when you consider yourself a doer, right, then see, this is an important thing to understand. When you consider yourself a doer, you're being cut off from the source, because thy will is not being done, your will is being done. Do you see? That's the cutoff, right? The cutoff is that I am not a vessel through which God is expressing herself. No, I am the expression of myself. That's the doer, you see? And so when you're living the life of a doer, you're cut off from the source. You're being a person in space and time, cut off from the awareness. You could call it awareness or God or whatever. You're cut off from the experience of being that, because you're being something that is separate from that. You're being something other than that. You're being the person, and you're identified with the body, and you're being a person in time, and so forth and so on. And so when that is the experience that you're having, you're cut off from the source, and thinking becomes the forefront of your experience. Why? Because you're thinking. And then you're in the world of the you that's doing the thinking, and all the rest of it shows up the way it shows up, right? That the world is out there, everybody's out there, you know, there's good reason to be afraid, there's good reason to feel threatened, because you know, what's out there can't be trusted. What's out there changes all the time. What's out there is when I watch the news, I see that there's crazy people out there. I see that, you know, more and more there's threats about people using guns and just shooting indiscriminately, and the weather's hotter than it's ever been. People are dying from heat. Catastrophes are happening. Buildings are falling. You know, the terrorists are out there. It's not safe to not lock your door anymore, right? And so the world of a person is a scary world. It's a threatening world. And so the person has to live in a state of anxiety, concern, apprehension, and fear. Has to keep relating to everything as a potential threat, relating to other people as a potential threat. And therefore, interpersonal relationships are stressful, right? Because the other person, you don't know what to expect from them. Even the people that you are closest to, that you love, are still separate people from you, and you don't know what to expect from them. And if they say something that you don't expect them to say, if they say something that feels threatening to you, even the person closest to you starts becoming suspect as part of the enemy that you have to cope with and deal with. Your own family, your parents, your children, right? Your partners. So that's the world of a person. And when you practice meditation, especially if you have the deep depth of understanding and you know that this whole business of being a person hinges on the idea that you're the doer, and that cuts you off from the source. Especially if you understand that, then when you practice meditation, right, you can shift out of that to pure being. What does that mean? Well, the way it occurs for me, pure being is like, it's kind of like you turn the radio on, but you don't have it tuned into a station. It's just, you hear the air of the awareness of the radio. Do you know what I'm saying? You hear the sound of the radio being on, but there's no station like that. Awareness, pure awareness is like that. It's just like there is no. You're not in the person reality, and when you practice meditation, especially if you're doing formal meditation, you're not being called upon to do anything, are you? No, you don't have to do anything, right? Especially in formal meditation, you don't have to do anything. The only thing that there is to do in formal meditation is not to do. It's not to do. That's the only thing to do in formal meditation is not to do. So it's an opportunity to not be the doer. You don't have to do anything. That's why I have said here, in terms of supporting you in practicing meditation, do not do meditation. If you do meditation, you're not meditating. Right? And even that sounds crazy to some people who aren't used to this type of talk, right? Because some people who are new at meditation, they want to do meditation. Because their orientation is, whatever there is that is an activity that you do. Therefore, I am going to do meditation. If you tell me not to do meditation, you're confusing me. Right? However, the reality of it is that meditation, if you're doing it correctly, is not something you do. Right? It's something that you allow. You allow, because the being that you are is already the case. Right? There's nothing to do. In fact, if you sit there and you think, then you're doing something, right? But if you sit there and you let go of thinking and you allow yourself to recognize that which has always been here, the awareness, and without that awareness, there would be no thinking, because awareness is first, then thinking, right? Without that awareness, there'd be no thinking, and the awareness is always here, right? So if you recognize awareness, if you have become enlightened, and that's what I define enlightened to be. If you have recognized awareness, right, here, now, in your present experience, if you have recognized awareness as the screen that everything is playing on, right, or as that which is not a thing, which has no form, right, but allows things to show up. If you have recognized that, if you have actually witnessed it, if you have actually seen it, you're enlightened, because that's what enlightenment is. Enlightenment is knowing what you are, knowing that awareness is what you are. And so if you recognize awareness and you accept that it is what you are, there's nothing beyond that, that's enlightenment. And that experience of enlightenment occurs for everybody at some time. Accidentally, it occurs for everybody at some time, right? In life. There are moments when you are so absorbed with whatever you're doing that you have no awareness of being a person. And then the awareness is present to what you're doing, right? That's an enlightened moment. And people have those moments. People have come to this class that have said, that I understand what you're talking about, because I have had moments in my life where I had felt this difficult to explain experience in which everything seemed to be obviously as it is. I had no questions. I wasn't at all confused. There was no stress. There was no coping anymore. I didn't necessarily understand it, but it felt pretty damn good, you know, to have that experience. And it didn't last. It changed back into, you know, the ordinary way of coping and dealing and stressing and struggling and being anxious or depressed or like that. And so it comes and goes for people and they don't necessarily understand it, but that's why in conversations like this, it can become understood, that you can understand that this is what it's like to be you. This is what it's like to be free from operating in the domain of a personality. And so upon the recognition of the truth about yourself, which has to happen, it has to happen. In other words, you can understand what I'm saying here as a concept when I talk about who you really are as awareness, right? But in order for the enlightenment to actually occur, you have to go beyond what the concept is and actually recognize awareness. You have to recognize awareness. And of course, when you recognize awareness, it is not you recognizing awareness, it's awareness recognizing itself. And then of course, the reason that that's the case and that that's possible is because as you continue to understand what there is to understand, you come to understand that awareness is all there is. It's all there is. So even you as a person is nothing but awareness, but you as a person is awareness that has had the effect of the divine hypnosis on it. Awareness has been affected by the divine hypnosis, which means that you're unaware of yourself as awareness and you think you're a person. But it's still awareness, you see, still awareness. However, and this is the thing that I really want to bring home to you, that, you know, because in my teaching and my practice and my studying, it's become evident to me that almost nobody has dealt with the idea of when I have the clarity of enlightenment, when I have had the recognition of enlightenment, when I have had the experience of enlightenment, as brief as it may have been, for some people it lasts for days at a time. I recall in my history that there were times when it lasted for weeks at a time, right? But it never lasts. It will never last. It can never last. And the reason I say that is because you must continue to live in this world as a person while you're in this world as a person. And you can be the awareness, but you must continue to identify with having a physical body, and you must continue to identify with being a person in the world of persons in order to function, in order to function interpersonally, right? And so there has to then be an answer to the question, how does enlightened awareness, how does awareness operate in the world as a person? Right? Because unless that's possible, enlightenment is a farce. Unless that's possible, the experience that you may have of yourself as awareness may happen from time to time, but you can't live in the world as that. It will have no consistency. It cannot have consistency. This is something that I think is, I don't know whether it's just me or whether it's really overlooked by a lot of teachers who the way they teach is that the whole ball game is to realize yourself as awareness, to become self-realized. That's the whole ball game, right? But even those teachers that say that are functioning in the world as a person, aren't they? Aren't they? You know, Eckhart, if you follow Eckhart Tolle around, right, he uses the toilet. Right? He uses the toilet. He goes to the doctor. He takes aspirin when he has a headache. Right? He has a girlfriend. Right? He has to deal with that relationship. She's separate from him as a person. He's separate from us as people. That's how he teaches us, because he's not us, he's separate from us. So all masters and enlightened beings and teachers are still identified with being a physical body and identified with being a person. And I don't know why, I don't really understand why they don't bring that out. and point to that and help people understand that you can be self-realized. That doesn't mean you're going to disappear. You won't disappear. This is one of the problems that happen for people, is because after they're self-realized and they don't disappear, and they're still in a physical body, and they still have people that they have to deal with in the world, they still have functions to deal with in the world, they still have to make a living, they still have to, you know, all of that still goes on, right? And then they say, well, this can't be enlightenment. This can't be enlightenment. What happened? I thought enlightenment meant that when I was enlightened, I wouldn't be troubled by anything anymore. I would be experiencing bliss all the time. I'd be happy all the time. Nothing could bother me at all. That is not possible in the world, is it? That's naive. That's not possible in the world. Nisargadatta, you know, he died of cancer. You know, Ramana Maharshi died of cancer. And when I say they died of cancer, I mean their body died of cancer, right? And when the body died, the person that they were in the world was gone. But while that body was alive, the person that they were in the world was there as an ego, So all this talk about the ego that is spoken in a lot of these teachings, that you have to kill the ego, you have to get rid of the ego, you know, you have to not be a person, right? That's a misunderstanding. You can't not be a person. You can't not have an ego, right? The ego is another way of talking about the personality, right? The personality. You can't not have an ego. As long as you exist in this world of time and space, and as long as you exist with a physical body, you have to have an ego. You've got to be a person, okay? So then the question becomes, okay, so if I recognize what enlightenment is, if I recognize my true identity as awareness or consciousness, and I've had moments of experiencing that, how do I then live my life as an enlightened person? Because enlightenment by definition means the end of suffering. And if it means the end of suffering, it means that how can I as a person not suffer, right? Because you can't get out of being a person. So the question is, how can I as a person not suffer? How can I as a person live an enlightened life, right? That's where we come in with the business of what cuts you off from the source, right? That's where the idea of, if you don't want to suffer, then you have to be convinced and experiencing that there is no doer. Because the doing is the hallmark of the person. The doing is what separates you from the source, right? I am the cause, not thy will be the cause, right? I am the cause, not thy will be the cause. And soon as you're the cause, right, then immediately that puts you in the person as a separate person from the rest of the world, and you must then be the doer. And once you're in the position of being the doer, the responsibility of being the doer is on your shoulders. Responsibility of being the doer is on your shoulders. In other words, when you don't do the right thing, you suffer, right? When you don't do the right thing, you reflect on it as the doer, and you feel guilty when you do things that are bad and wrong, right? And you feel like a failure when you don't succeed, right? This is the psychological craziness, the neurotic psychological craziness that drives people to addiction. It's the psychological craziness that drives people to spend their life making money to escape, making money to buy more technical gadgets and devices and TVs to distract themselves so they don't have to pay attention to the truth, which is that they're miserable. And of course you're miserable. You have to be miserable when you are limited to the life of a person. You have to be miserable. How can you not be miserable? You're going to die, first of all, and you don't want to die, but you have nothing to say about it. Your body's going to get old and sick, and you have nothing to say about it. All right? You're separate from the rest of the world, and you're in competition with the rest of the world, right? And so then your life is about protecting yourself. Your life is about paying attention to the threats that are coming at you all the time. Your life is about tolerating and put up with the rest of these assholes, right? including the assholes in your own home, right? That's what your life becomes about. And so it's miserable. So one of the first things that you have to come into contact with in order to be open to the possibility that's being spoken about here is you have to acknowledge your misery. You have to acknowledge that you're miserable. That's not that easy to acknowledge because your misery lives in a sea of misery. Your misery lives in a sea of misery. Your human misery lives in the sea of human misery. And so that, as I often say here, that the mental illness of humanity is considered normality. The mental illness of humanity is considered normal because everybody's crazy. The misery of humanity is considered just typical human existence. The misery of humanity is considered just typical human existence. That's why we have all the drugs and prescription medications. So that you can spend your life avoiding being aware of your misery. So you can spend your life distracting yourself from your misery. So you can spend your life altering your brain and altering your moods and pursuing happiness, right? You can spend your life chasing the dollar, pursuing happiness, continuing to find where you can get pleasure and avoid pain. That's the human life, and that's miserable. That's a miserable existence. So the first thing that has to happen for you to really be motivated to be interested in this conversation is to be willing to admit the truth, that you're miserable. And you can admit the fact of your misery when you come to realize that, as the Buddha said, that suffering, that misery is not necessary. It's not necessary. It's possible to experience being free from misery, being free from suffering. And that has been called enlightenment. And the more I think about it, I think the word enlightenment is a very practical and useful word. It points to a way of being in this world in which there is no suffering. That's what it's defined as. That's what it points to. So I don't think it's all that mystical. I don't consider it religious. I think it's actually a practical truth. But only if you understand that upon becoming enlightened, it will not make the difference unless you can translate that enlightenment into how to be an enlightened person. And the way to be an enlightened person is to allow yourself to make contact with, truly consider deep in your understanding of the truth that you have no choice about what's happening, that you are not a doer, and that everything is determined. This rails against your personality. It rails against your personality. That's the thing that the person starts to say, oh no, I can buy this up until that. And I've been there, so I know that that's the case. I've been there because in my own experience, the whole idea of not having free will I couldn't get that, because it seems so true and so real that I do have free will. And therefore, my brain and my mind is saying, I can understand the concept of it, but I can't accept that it's true because it doesn't seem to be true. I don't know how to live unless I do, right? My whole life has been about being a doer, right? I don't know how to live unless I do. But here's the deal. If you understand this thing that I'm about to say, that can alleviate that confusion, right? In the life of a person, which you must continue to live, in that life of a person which you must continue to live, the way things occur have to be consistent with the idea that you're separate from the world. That's the life of a person. The way things occur has to include the idea that you're separate from the world, you're separate from other people, right? Has to include that. Has to include the idea that you're living in space and time. And in that setup, you must be an actor. In that setup, you must be an actor. It's an illusion, just like the whole idea of being a person is an illusion, right? But as an illusion, it's a real illusion. And as an illusion that involves time and space and being separate from other people, you do act. You do act. You do act. And you must continue to operate as if you do act. You cannot escape from that, just like you can't escape from time. You can't escape from having a physical body. It's all the same thing. It's part of the person reality. You do act as a person in the person reality. But the person reality is an illusion. Do you understand? It's an illusion. And that's why we can say it's not true that you're the doer. And yet at the same time, it is apparent that you are the doer in the world of a person. And so you continue to operate the same way. It's the understanding that's liberating. So you continue to operate the same way. You continue to think about what you're going to do. You continue to consider things before you make choices, right? You consider to do that. And you know more clearly than ever that having done that, the one thing that you can still see, even in the world of a person, is having made a decision or a choice and act upon it. After that's happened, you have no control over what happens next, do you? No. So even in the world of a person, you can see that much, right? That there's something causing what's happening. And it must not be you, because you make choices and decisions, and after you make those choices and decisions and you take actions, you have no control over what happens after that, right? So the idea that you're a doer is really isolated to the experience you're having of yourself as a person having to function that way. But outside of that, you can see that you have no control over what happens, right? If you can get that understanding about the idea of being a doer is only the way it occurs to you in the life of a person, as a person. If you can get that understanding, then there's no confusion. Then there's no conflict about the idea that it seems so apparent that you're a doer when in fact you're not. If you can get the idea that that's because you're in the world of being a person. That's all. You are identified with being a person. You are identified. It's just like if you were an actor in a movie, you are identified with the role you're playing, aren't you? Right. You are identified. Right. But you know you're not really that at the same time. Okay. That's an enlightened person. An enlightened person is free from the implications of being a person because they know it's something that I'm identifying myself with because I have to, because I'm still in the world.
Right.
Yes.
You don't take it personally.
That's right. That's very good. You don't take anything personally because nothing is personal. Nothing is personal. You know, what's happening, thy will be done, is not personal. It's not personal. That's important to understand. There's no God person up there who is personally doing personal things to you. God is not a person. God is as they said in Star Wars, the Force, right? The Force. Right. God is not a person. God is an energetic, God is an intelligent, energetic field. And if you understand that, it takes away all this confusion about, well, why does God do this? No, God's not a person. It's an energetic, intelligent field. Things happen, deeds are done, but there's no doer thereof. This is the correct quote from the Buddha. So the Buddha was clear that there was no doer, right? When he was teaching, he was just like I'm teaching here. He was teaching people, many of whom, maybe even most of whom, were not fully realized and were not yet living as a non-doer, right? And for those who are not fully realized in that regard, right, then you have to give them some rules to follow, so they cannot, make too much of a mess of their life. It's the same thing with other religions, right? The 10 Commandments, right? There are basic rules and these basic rules are basically saying, for you ignorant people who don't know who you are and therefore can't naturally act in a moral way, here's some rules for you to follow so you stay out of trouble. Don't kill one another. The rules. Because you have to understand, if you're clear that you're not a doer, right, the only way you can be really clear that you're not a doer is to be clear that nobody's a doer. Therefore, nobody can do anything to you. You can't do anything to hurt yourself, and nobody can do anything to hurt you. You know, there's a story that they tell about Buddha. I don't know if it was about Buddha or some other enlightened being, but the story makes the point. And the point is, there was a young girl that was one of his devotees, right, that got into a romantic relationship with another boy that was a devotee, and she got pregnant, right? And so she wanted to, she didn't want to take responsibility for being pregnant from the boy. She wanted to protect him. So she said Buddha made her pregnant. And so what the enlightened Buddha did was, when they told him, you know, that this girl says this is your child, he said, okay. And so they said, well, you have to raise the child now. So he said, okay, and he took the child. And he took care of the child and raised the child. And then years later, the same girl wanted her baby. She decided she wanted her baby. So then she went back and she said, I lied. He's not the father. This guy's the father, and I want my child. And the Buddha said, okay, and gave her the baby. This is an example of the clarity of the enlightened person seeing thy will be done. Whatever's happening is happening, and it's not coming from me, and it's not coming from them. And when you see things that way, it's easy to just accept whatever is happening. Well, but you see, one of the things about this and I'm going to say something right now that a lot of people aren't going to like, because the truth, the pure truth, does not involve karma. The pure truth does not involve saving the world. The pure truth does not involve this naive notion that people have that we've got to save the world, we've got to save the planet, you know, we have to pray and hope that humanity wakes up so there's no more wars and all that stuff, right? You have to understand something. That's a view from the person. That's a view from the person. The kingdom of heaven, right, is this world the way it is. The kingdom of heaven is this world the way it is. The thing that makes it the kingdom of heaven is the way you're viewing it is different. And the way you're viewing it that makes it the kingdom of heaven is you realize if you understand these things that are being taught, and if you're experiencing the truth as it is, you realize there's no death, right? We've talked about this. There's no death really. And everything that's happening from the viewpoint of time, space, and being a person is a complete dream. It's a complete illusion, right? It's not really happening. If it's not really happening and there's no death, what's the problem? What's the problem? It's just consciousness playing. That's all. You go to the movies and eat popcorn and watch this shit on the screen all the time, and that's called entertainment, right? Why? Because the way you're relating to it, right? Well, it's the same thing with this. You could actually be related to life the way life is right now without anything changing, and see it as being perfect and not needing to change at all. You can't, from the perspective of a person, see what I'm talking about. You have to see it from the view of not being a person. You have to see it from a view where you see the dream as a dream. You have to see it from the view where you see death isn't real. And from the view of dream as a dream and death isn't real, there's no problem the way it is. Einstein knew this. Einstein got this. Quantum physicists scientifically say today that everything is determined.
That's unbelievable reading that.
Scientists say today that everything is determined. And then the next thing they say is, although everything is determined, we don't know what's going to happen. So, you know, I understand that it's difficult, that there's these yes buts and what ifs, and, you know, do you mean this? Do you mean that? Right? That's because you're stuck in the person way of being and seeing. But but it's possible to get free enough from that to stop being in conflict with the way things are.
That's what I would like to be happening.
Okay, well then pay attention.
I am.
All right.